Hello, good afternoon. My name is Christine Ockrent. I'm a journalist based in Paris, and I have the privilege to moderate this discussion about the new transatlantic order with a great panel, starting, of course, with General John Allen, who's currently the president of the Brookings Institute and the latest recipient of the Václav Havel award. In Washington, D.C., I'm happy to see John Lindsay, who is the Senior Vice President of the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. Thank you for being with us. In Berlin, Dr. Thomas Bagger, who is the Diplomatic Advisor to President Steinmeier in Berlin. And with us here in Bratislava, Bruno Macais, who is Senior Research Associate with the Wilfrid Martens Center. But before we engage into exploring the new transatlantic agenda, with, of course, perfect timing, given President Biden's tour in Brussels earlier this week, and we all know that he's currently in Geneva, meeting with President Putin. Before we engage into this discussion, let's hear from Richard Wyke with the Pew Research Center, who will give us the latest results about the international image of the Biden administration. Richard?
Great. Thank you so much, Christine. Yes, thank you, Christine. And thanks to GLOBSEC for including me as part of this event. Really happy to have a chance to talk with all of you about some recent survey research that we've done at the Pew Research Center, looking at transatlantic relations, and in particular, looking at views in Europe and elsewhere towards the United States now that we've had this transition from the Trump to the Biden administration. So what I'm going to talk with you about a little bit is a survey we conducted in 16 publics, 9 in Europe, 6 in the Asia Pacific region, plus Canada. And we've been doing this kind of work now for 2 decades at Pew. And we see some of the biggest changes we've ever seen in this survey, with some very large improvements in overall ratings for the United States. So if you, for instance, look at 12 countries that we surveyed both last year and this year. Last year, across those 12 countries, a median of just 17% said they had confidence in President Trump to do the right thing in world affairs. It's up to 75% for President Biden this year. In terms of overall attitudes towards the United States, just 34% had a favorable view of the U.S. in those 12 countries last year. It's up to 62% this time around. So very big changes in terms of how people feel about who's in the White House, and that's had a big impact on what they think of the United States overall. And you see some remarkably large differences when you ask people about the sort of personal characteristics and leadership traits of Biden versus Trump. Very few said President Trump was well qualified. Most think that President Biden is. Most said that President Trump was dangerous, that he was arrogant. Very few say this about Biden. Trump's strongest characteristic when he was in office tended to be that many saw him as a strong leader, but even on that measure, Biden does better than Trump did. So part of it's about personality, but a lot of it is also about policy. We saw a lot of opposition over the years to President Trump's withdrawing the United States from international commitments, to his putting up barriers between the U.S. and the rest of the world. In contrast, people welcome the more multilateralist approach of the Biden administration. So you can see that, for example, when it comes to climate, a lot of support for the Biden administration re-entering the Paris Climate Accords. I'll give you one example of that. Back in 2019, when we last asked about Trump's climate policies in France, just 9% supported the U.S. withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. 91% in France this year support the U.S. Rejoining that agreement. There's also a lot of support for the U.S. rejoining the WHO, for the U.S. accepting more refugees into the country, and for Biden's idea of hosting a summit of democratic nations, although there are concerns about U.S. democracy, and I'll talk briefly about those in just a moment. So people do think the U.S. is acting more multilaterally, but even with Biden in the White House, there are still concerns about how America conducts itself in world affairs. So majorities in most of the countries where we did the survey say that they believe the U.S. doesn't take into account the interest of other countries when it's making foreign policy decisions. And that's a complaint we've heard about the U.S. going back 2 decades now, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House. There's still this sense that the U.S. doesn't really listen to other countries, doesn't really take into account their interest when it's making foreign policy decisions. So there are still concerns about how the U.S. operates in international affairs. And there are also, as we see in this survey, strong concerns about the health of domestic politics in the United States. There's a question where we ask people, do you think the U.S. is currently a good example of a democracy, that it was never a good example of a democracy, or that it used to be a good example, but hasn't been in recent years? And what we find is that majorities in almost all the places where we did the survey say that the U.S. used to be a good example, but it isn't any longer. Fewer than 1 in 5 say the U.S. is currently a good example of a democracy. So I think that finding is something that is very relevant as President Biden seeks to restore confidence in American leadership, as he and others seek to restore confidence in some form of a liberal international order. They're also going to have to restore confidence in the liberal component of that order, and restore confidence that the American political system can function better than it has over the last few years. So overall, this study finds a big improvement in terms of how people think about the United States among a number of key allies and partners, but there are also lingering concerns about how the U.S. acts on the world stage, and lingering concerns in particular about the health of its democracy. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That's a very good introduction to our discussion. Of course, may I remind the audience that you are welcome to send questions, which I will discover on this magical tablet. But let's get started with you, General Allen. The Transatlantic Alliance is an old lady, 72 years old. It has had its ups and downs, and mostly downs, for the past 4 years. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, even dared say it was in a state of cerebral collapse. That was in December 19 in an interview to The Economist. Would you say that the last summit Monday has indeed introduced a new cycle in the history of the alliance with the Agenda 2020, and of course the insistence on the threat that Russia represents, but also China, which is now characterized as a systemic challenge?
Well, it's a great question. First, it's wonderful to be back at GLOBSEC. As I always do in the panels that I have, I ask everyone, if you have a chance, to look at the colors of the lanyards around people's necks, and if you see someone wearing a green lanyard, they are the ones who made this conference happen. So don't hesitate to thank those young Slovaks and Central Europeans who came to staff this effort. They're the future of this region. I think that the moment on the 14th of the NATO summit was really historic in many ways, and often that term is really historic has become a bit trite, but in this case I believe it is true. President Biden brought to the continent in many respects, a reinvigorated America. And he was very clear about the U.S. commitment to the transatlantic relationship writ large, what we're also hearing called the Euro-Atlantic relationship. He was very clear about the U.S. commitment to NATO as an alliance, very clear on U.S. commitment to the Article 5 of the NATO Charter. We should not be surprised that the conversation about NATO would ultimately come around to the issue of what are the great challenges and what are the great threats that we face. And of course, Russia was singled out in the communique as a threat. The Chinese, which have typically been devoid from conversation or mention by NATO as a body, now have the attention of the alliance. And it should, given the enormity of Chinese influence in Europe, but the enormity of Chinese influence on the world stage. And so there were many developments, I think, that were very positive, that reaffirmed the United States' commitment to the transatlantic entity, if you will, to NATO in general, but I think also very importantly that emanated from this event was the determination, as you said, to embrace NATO 2030, but to get on aggressively with the issue of a new strategic concept. The last one was 2010. The world has moved on from 2010. We have got to have a strategic concept that takes into account not just the threats, but the strategic environment in which we now live. One dominated by cyber issues, one dominated by issues associated with climate, et cetera. Here is our chance. A new Biden administration, a robust NATO. Let's get on with it.
Let's go to Berlin. Dr. Bagger, thank you for being with us. We've learned that Chancellor Merkel is invited to the White House on July 15, the first European leader to be invited. Is that a tribute to her leadership before she actually leaves the political scene, or is it time for very tense negotiations on China, which is a major trading partner for Germany, and one could see some degree of reluctance on the Chancellor's part about the NATO summit declaration, but also on Russia with the issue of the Nord Stream 2 gazoduc. So more political pressure when the Chancellor is actually meeting with President Biden in Washington, D.C.?
Well, thank you, Christine. And first of all, congratulations to John for to the Havel Prize. I envy everyone who can be in Bratislava today. I'm tied to my desk in Berlin. But on your question, Christine, I think, first of all, there is a palpable sense of relief in Berlin and across Germany at the message of this US administration that America is back. The return to multilateral action, to the renewal of the US's alliances, namely NATO, all of that comes with great relief here, and certainly in the way the former president had singled out Germany for his ire. I would consider Germany one of the great winners of the policy changes that have come from Washington and that are expressed in the most recent series of summits. At the same time, we've all noticed in these first 5 months that the center of gravity of U.S. foreign policy has changed and is changing. There is a change underway, and the centrality of the rise of China to future US strategy and foreign policy will have profound consequences for Europe and for Germany as well. And that's not to be resolved today, but it was just sort of an opening discussion at the NATO summit and the G7 summit that will continue in the years to come. And I think it will be one of the great challenges to navigate that for any new German government that will emerge from our own September elections. Now, there's also a protocol side to this, as things are systematic with this US administration. And we've seen the Japanese Prime Minister and the South Korean President being the first guests in the White House. Now Merkel The Chancellor will be the first European to go there. And also there, I think it's a mix of both of what you mentioned. It's a recognition of her outstanding role as a leader of Germany and of Europe. She will leave office at the end of September, or sort of once a new government is formed. So the president will receive her in the White House before. That's a measure of recognition, but there is plenty of stuff to talk about. And I think you've mentioned China, indeed, where she has somewhat different nuances also in her public appearances after the NATO summit, and said, let us focus on what the West has to offer as a positive vision, and let us not define what the West is and should be simply by who we are against. And the second thing is with respect to Russia. It is good that there are now direct conversations and negotiations between Berlin and Washington, also on the issue of the gazoduc, as I learned, of the pipeline that you mentioned. We all know about the different positions that do exist, not just across the Atlantic, but also within Europe on this project. But I think both sides, the US president and the German government, have made it clear that this project, however controversial, should not be the one to define our relationship as we go forward.
John Lindsay, you're the Vice President for the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. We know that China is indeed the very rare topic where there is a strong political consensus in Washington. Is the NATO summit declaration considered a victory for the Biden administration, even by its Republican opponents?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Christine. Before I answer it, let me join with Thomas and send my regrets that I'm not able to be in Bratislava, but I'm very fortunate that the conference organizers have invited me, and I'm glad to join you here today. I would say that the answer to your question depends upon who you ask. Number one, I do think it is true, as you pointed out, that when it comes to China, there is broad and I think relatively deep bipartisan agreement that China is, in essence, job one or challenge number one for American foreign policy. But also, I think there's a fair amount of consensus across the aisle among Democrats and Republicans about the challenge painted by Russia. And these are sort of two issues that really stand out against a lot of other issues in foreign policy that divide the two parties and also create divisions within the two parties. Having said that, I don't think it's the case that there has been agreement on what President Biden has accomplished in his trip so far. Again, politics in the United States are very polarized. They increasingly affect foreign policy as well as domestic policy. And there has been criticism that the president, while he has gotten words from the European, he hasn't gotten deeds. And again, I agree with John that what happened at NATO and the recent discussions about settling some trade issues with the European Union are significant. They are a very good start. But in this, as in much in life, it's not so much how you start, but how you finish. And I think the really interesting question in the months and years to come is the degree to which we're able to translate the agreements and sentiments expressed in the communiques into actual common policy. And I think that is going to prove to be exceedingly difficult. Obviously, there are differences within Europe on these questions. If you go from Lisbon to Vilnius, you can get a variety of perspectives on where China rates as a challenge to Europe and also how to deal with it. And there are also divisions between Europe and the United States over how to proceed. Overshadowing this is something that Thomas pointed out. Germany has elections in September, which could potentially add a whole new dynamic here. Likewise, next year we're going to have the French presidential elections. So a big question for many Americans is what kind of Europe are we going to be dealing with a year from now? And are we going to be able to, in fact, take our commitment to general principles and values and translate them into coordinated policy? And I think that's going to be a big challenge, but I would note that's what diplomats are for.
Of course, Beijing has reacted with a great deal of aggressive vocabulary, as usual, telling that NATO members are hypocrites and that the US are developing a Cold War mentality. And indeed, Beijing has increased for the last 2 days the military pressure upon Taiwan with some 28 fighter jets, I believe, circling around the island. Do you feel, John Lindsay, that indeed Europeans should be more aware of the stakes in the Indian Ocean and in the southern China Sea, even though I believe France and the UK have increased their naval presence in that part of the world?
Certainly, I would think Europeans should be paying attention to these issues, but it's not merely a matter of the military threat that China poses to countries in East Asia or South Asia. We shouldn't forget the clashes that occurred in the Himalayas over the last year, but the broader challenge that China presents on the economic front, but also to the liberal rules-based international order, the notion that there should be agreed upon rules that govern how we interact. China clearly wishes to rewrite the rules of the game. That poses challenges to the West. I think it's pretty apparent in Europe. There's growing concern about Chinese human rights abuses, the economic challenge that China faces, and I will note the reaction in many European capitals to the Chinese decision to sanction European officials over their support or their criticism of China's treatment of the Uyghurs. So this is an issue that's going to go on. Now, there's a broader issue about what kind of military contribution European countries can make to any effort to deter Chinese aggression. And I think there's a really good debate to be had there. I know in some European capitals either discount the nature of the Chinese threat, certainly to Europe, but also to others. Likewise, they may discount what it is that European countries can actually bring to that issue. And I think if you look at American foreign policy, while President Biden clearly is trying to rally the traditional European allies, rally NATO, not all the eggs are being put in the NATO or transatlantic basket. Obviously, we have something called the Indo-Pacific, as well as the Indo-Pacific or the Quad operation, as well as bilateral relations with South Korea and China. And I think also one of the things that Europe is going to have to struggle with is to what extent thinking about China, at least in military terms, is going to have consequences for Europe's ability to deter Russia. I think that's a big issue, obviously, much more so as you go to Central Europe or go to the Baltic countries. And issues are going to have to be debated. Obviously, one of the big questions, again, on the military front is to what extent we're going to see European countries live up to their 2014 Wales Summit pledge to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, and most notably the largest economy in NATO on that score besides the United States is Germany, and it's well below the 2% mark. And we'll see what happens after the German elections.
Yes, but President Biden was so nice to us Europeans that he hardly mentioned the sort of burden sharing issue during the summit last Monday. Bruno Machais, your former Portuguese Secretary for European Affairs, you've written extensively upon European and Asian issues. To what extent, in your view, within the 27 members of the EU, there is a varying degree of discomfort if not disagreement, with the 2 paragraphs regarding China in the final NATO communique last Monday?
I don't think we should exaggerate that. There's a difference about method and means, as Jim Lindsay said, about how to proceed. But we should be clear that on the question of how to regard the Chinese regime or on the values question, there is really very little disagreement. If you had a 2-hour seminar with the top leaders from Europe and the US, they would agree on everything. Of course, in politics, often the question is not about that. It's not a seminar, it's about what to do. And I'll get to that, but there are some disagreements there. There's also a difference of style. Perhaps Europeans don't like to have that blunt, direct language in the final statements, but that's to some extent a question of style. Remember that our political, legal culture in Europe over the past 70 years is about rules. And rules, as you learn in law school, are impartial and objective. They don't talk about whom they apply to. They apply to everyone. So for a European drafting those statements, it's enough to say that you have to respect freedom of navigation and you don't have to add against China. But let's not exaggerate those elements, which are actually can be productive in the discussions that thankfully are now happening instead of the shouting.
But there are, of course, trade issues, and in that respect, European interests, starting with the German ones, are very different.
Let me be also very blunt on that. If you look at the level of investment that's going into China over the past 2 years, it's mostly American. Goldman Sachs went strongly into the Chinese market last year, BlackRock. So I actually object to the idea that it's Europeans that are engaging with trade with China. Everyone is. The notion of decoupling that you sometimes hear from Washington has remained at the level of rhetoric. And I think it will remain at the level of rhetoric. We're still looking for the exact approach, but it's more about strategic sectors of the economy rather than generalized decoupling. Final point. The US and Europe have evolved along parallel tracks over the past 5 years. The change happened around 2015, 2016, when both the US and Europe realized that China was not converging to a Western model. Perhaps they realized a little bit too late, but they did realize. And they realized that China had bold ambitions about shaping the global system. But the change actually happened simultaneously on both sides of the Atlantic. And since then, there's been an evolution that is quite similar. It's Europe, not the US, that came up with the idea of a systemic rivalry, values-based concept, which I noticed the US has now recently started to adapt. In Blinken, for example, Secretary Blinken has adopted that language quite a lot. So we'll get to that when we talk about strategic autonomy later, but I don't see that there's really, and quite unfair to Europeans to suggest that they either less clear on the values question or that they are more driven by the sort of the vile metal of trade than Americans are. We just have different ideas about how to deal with this huge challenge that China is. And on both sides of the Atlantic, there's a consciousness that you cannot make mistakes. And this is the question that's going to define the next half a century. And so obviously there are differences of opinion about what to do. And that's why I think strategic autonomy comes in. The Europeans want to have a word on what to do, on how to proceed.
When it comes to Russia, would you say that there is more consensus within the 27? Although, of course, risk assessment is quite different. There was an interesting research by the Munich Security Conference showing, of course, that from now north to east to the southern part of Europe, the risks are not the same, and the assessment is not even the same compared to the US. For us in Europe, the first risk is climate, and in the US is China and cyber.
Russia is a different question. On Russia, you have people in Europe that actually think this administration is being too soft. People who are angry about the meeting that is happening right now between Presidents Biden and Putin. And then there are people in Europe that actually have not only trade connections, but long-standing cultural, intellectual links to Russia. Russia, of course, is part of European history. It's been part of European history for much longer than the United States has been a country. So Russia, I think Europeans do have to come up with a common position, and it's not going to be easy. But on China, there is a common position.
General Allen, it is obvious that President Biden is indeed reinforcing or restoring the American leadership in the Western world, albeit in a more polite and even affectionate manner than many of his predecessors. But there have been some bruises about Afghanistan. And of course, for obvious reasons relating to your brilliant military career, I'm sure this is an issue that you feel strongly about. European allies felt that they had not been consulted or even warned that the US would hasten its military retreat from Afghanistan.
Retreat.
Well, it's a hard word.
It is a hard word, and it's a difficult moment for us. And I can understand why the Europeans felt as though they were not properly consulted. Many of us were caught by surprise by the decision. And the decision's been made. The troops are coming down. I think the challenge for us going forward, not just in the United States, but more broadly within NATO and the transatlantic relationship, but more broadly the community of nations, is how we can continue to support the Afghan people. There are many people in the world that are willing to dismiss the 20 years that we spent in Afghanistan as having been an investment that returned nothing. And the truth, of course, is much different than that. The quality of the life of the Afghan people, by and large, the life expectancy, the child mortality, the women dying in childbirth, the education levels that have improved. There has been so much that has been accomplished in Afghanistan that to dismiss it out of hand is patently wrong and unfair. But the challenge, of course, that we face is what will the Taliban ultimately do? Because in many respects, the Trump administration tied the hands of the Biden administration with respect to having to honor an agreement with the Taliban. I may be the only person in this audience who's actually negotiated with the Taliban. And here's what I believe, and that it is not in the DNA of the Taliban to ever honor any agreement that they have with apostates or infidels. And that's who they made this agreement with. Well, 150,000 troops couldn't separate the Taliban from Al-Qaeda. Why would we expect that they would separate voluntarily now when Al-Qaeda has been a great ally of the Taliban, and it was from the safe haven provided by the Taliban that Al-Qaeda was able to attack the West? And why would we believe that the Taliban would give up its aspirations for an Islamic emirate? And why, and this is the heart of my concern, why would we ever believe that the rights of women and minorities in Afghanistan will ever be respected by the Taliban, who are already beating women in town squares and assassinating female journalists and killing many young Afghan girls who were on their way to school recently? So we have a lot of work to do, not just as a nation, the United States, but work to do as a transatlantic alliance and more broadly the global community of values, democracies, to support Afghan women, to support the sanctity of the follow-on government in Afghanistan, to do what we can to strengthen the economy. And I am very cautious of those who would say that the Taliban with whom we have been dealing in Doha and other places are some form of a rewarmed, modernized, insightful organization. They are not. It's not in them to be that way. We need to be very careful about how the Taliban will react after the departure of the United States and NATO. And we need to do all that we can to establish mechanisms to support our Afghan allies, to support the Afghan women, and ultimately to do what we can to provide as much stability as we possibly can for Afghanistan in the aftermath of our departure.
General Allen, of course, we know that President Biden's administration and many speeches by Tony Blinken and also by Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, are turning upon values, but there's also a dimension of continuity with the previous administration, certainly not in style, but in substance, when indeed the doctrine very much has to do with the idea that foreign policy is another dimension of domestic policy, and that it should address the interests of the American middle class. Is that a dimension which we in Europe should be concerned about, wary about?
Well, it is certainly going to be prominent, I think, in the Biden administration and in its policy for the formulation, its process for the formulation of policy. One of the reasons that we had a Trump administration was his capacity to rally the disaffection of large segments of the American population that believed that their interests as Americans had been mortgaged on behalf of a relationship and foreign engagement, a relationship overseas and foreign engagement. That globalization hadn't worked, that the Fourth Industrial Revolution had left them at a disadvantage. And so I think wisely, the Biden administration has in fact recognized that if there will be a foreign policy that will be effective for the United States, there has to be a relevance of that foreign policy for the middle class. It can't just sell in Washington or in New York City or in Los Angeles. It has to sell in Des Moines. It has to sell in Omaha. And that's a challenge. It's a challenge for the reasons that Jim Lindsay mentioned, which is that we are terribly polarized right now in the United States. And when the president talked about America having been played as a sucker by our allies, or when he had depicted the EU as the #1 foe of America, and having seen all of that be so heavily digested by large segments of the American electorate that voted for him and his ilk, turning that around will be a great challenge for the Biden administration. And none of us could be more pleased than, first of all, the people that he chose to populate his administration, because they not only are pretty well experienced, but they also, in many respects, like no administration in American history, they look like America. The numbers of women in this administration and people of color. This is a great accomplishment from my perspective, and it gives the administration the capacity to make the moral argument that we have to link our foreign policy to the future of our domestic policy and to the American people. Otherwise, the irrelevance of the two or the discontinuity of the two will defeat both.
Dr. Bagger, in Berlin, there have been many interesting research papers by the German Marshall Fund or the European Council on Foreign Relations showing how much European public opinion from north to east to south has changed towards the US, and it's particularly true in Germany. I've noticed in a GMF paper that 39% of Germans, only 39%, consider the US to be the necessary partner, and the French, 43%. You know, something's changing there. How do you explain such an erosion of the American leadership in the minds of the German people?
Well, I think maybe two things. I think the first is what I tried to say at the beginning is the great sense of relief all across Germany with this administration. And it resembles really an experience I had after being posted at our embassy in Washington in the early 2000s, and then coming back to Berlin and witnessing Barack Obama when he was still candidate in the summer of 2008 here in Berlin. And the mood was, we would love to love America again. So there's a great reservoir of sympathy that Biden is tapping into, and that he can tap into, and that he can mobilize. But we should not underestimate that there is also a lingering doubt that will not go away quickly. You can correct policies, but this nagging sense that something like the Trump administration can happen in America will not go away easily. If it can happen once, why can it never happen again? So it's not as the doubt is not as easily repaired or made to disappear. And so I think among the great challenges that we have and the common tasks across the Atlantic is not just the rise of China, the risks emanating from Russia. It's not just trade and technology cooperation or combating climate change, but there's a huge task ahead of us that is really a joint challenge, which is to come to terms with the future of our democracies and to twist that a little. What does the democracy of the future actually look like, with a political discourse that is undergoing structural change through the change of the media, the emergence of social media, and other things. All of these questions are on the table. We've seen them. We've seen the results, not just in the polarization of the US. We've seen it also in many European political systems and societies. No one is immune from these changes and partly erosions of our of the workings of our democratic systems. But I think it is a difference whether you have someone the like of Trump elected in a European state, or whether he is the president of the United States, because that has a global impact that does not leave Europe untouched. And Germany, as I said earlier, found itself in the crosshairs of the previous president. So the sense of relief may be higher here than elsewhere. But I think the level of doubt that you point to also from the Pew polls, I think that's very real. And if at all, it will recede over time, but not quickly, not overnight.
Bruno Macias, there is talk within European leaders about the necessity for the EU proper to increase its defense capacities. Madame Merkel prefers to talk about European sovereignty. Emmanuel Macron talks about strategic autonomy. The Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, is not at all in agreement with that very concept. Would you say that this is an issue which we Europeans have to come to terms with to have stronger military capacities within the NATO framework? Is that, in your view, one of the major issues that we have to tackle in the months or the years to come?
Yes, there's some divisions in Europe on this. Obviously, I'm with those who think that Europe needs to develop those capacities. Again, as I said before, this is not a question of going in different directions or having a different perception of the world or having a different value perception of the world. It's about having capacities to make decisions, and then we can make decisions together. I think we're probably moving towards a framework, at least the way Europeans see it, where the Transatlantic Alliance perhaps becomes something more similar to the Entente Cordiale between France and Britain.
It didn't end very well.
Well, no.
Especially these days.
It didn't end very well, but it could have ended worse if it wasn't for the work that had been done in bringing France and Britain together. But what was distinctive about it, there was a lot of shared perceptions of the world, but there were capacities on both sides. And Europeans dream about having these capacities, and that dream is not going to die. I am told, by the way, that yesterday in the summit that both von der Leyen and Charles Michel tried to explain what strategic autonomy is to...
Would they agree together about what it means? Because they don't always agree on many issues.
That's right. That I don't know, but I hope so. But I don't think on the other side there was an immediate understanding of what the issue is. The issue is, the way I see it, about being able to make decisions. There's skepticism in Europe. We have to be honest about this. There's skepticism in Europe about the US's effectiveness. I think we're actually more solid about the health of American democracy than about the effectiveness of American foreign policy. Remember Iraq. In Europe, that's still remembered. And so we want to be part of the debate of how to deal with Russia, how to deal with China, but have capacities that allow us to be a voice that is respected and listened by Washington. And I'm part of those Europeans who keep insisting that Washington should be happy about this. Because after all, the world is becoming more dangerous, and if the Europeans have corresponding capacities, it will be much easier to deal with the challenges that we have.
John Lindsay, should the US be happy about us Europeans wanting to be more assertive in terms of defense, or is there a high degree of skepticism about European effectiveness?
Christine, I suspect if you ask most Americans, the answer is going to tend toward the skepticism side of the continuum. A great deal of concern that in Europe there will be talk about gaining capacity, but relatively little follow through. And I think a lot of that will be measured again, going back to the standard set by the 2014 Wales Summit of a 2% of GDP going toward defense. And while it is true that, as you remarked before, Christine, President Biden at NATO didn't bang the table the same way his predecessor did over the defense commitment, this is still going to be an issue in American politics. It would not surprise me to see it come up again if we do not see significant improvement in European defense. But I want to be clear, some European countries have met or exceeded the 2% threshold. Others are on the path to it. But obviously, I think at this point, a majority of the NATO members haven't. So this is going to be an issue. But I do want to go back, in this context, to sort of a broader issue that you put on the table when you asked John about foreign policy for the middle class and points that Thomas and Bruno made. And that is, I think President Biden fundamentally understands that he has a big challenge as president of the United States, and that his foreign policy, in some sense, has to begin at home. That's why he came into office. His focus has really been on the domestic economy. It has been on particularly getting the pandemic under control and getting the American economy going. And that's really for three reasons, and they play into foreign policy. One is the necessity to show that America still works, that it has capacity. And I think if you look at many European countries, look at public opinion polls across Europe and elsewhere, there's a fair degree of skepticism about the health and the future of the United States in terms of the power it brings to the world table. That in some ways, the United States is a declining power, in contrast to China as a rising power. And I think part of what the Biden team wants to do is to counteract that. I think a real second thing is, and Bruno alluded to this, is that the United States has really ruined its reputation for competence. If you go back over the last 2 decades, Bruno mentioned the Iraq War, you can mention Abu Ghraib, we can talk about the Great Recession where a subprime mortgage crisis in the United States nearly brought down the global economy. We get to the mishandling of the pandemic, and then January 6th. I think a lot of questions raised about the actual competence of the United States. Whatever capacity it has, does it have the ability to produce effective policies? Not policies that necessarily sound good, but actually accomplish what they set out to do. And the third challenge, and it's one Bruno alluded to, is the issue of consistency. That is, can Joe Biden reassure people that he can make his policies stick? Now, I think in the first 2 C's of capability and competence, President Biden may be able to make significant progress. I think on this issue of consistency, it's going to be a harder sell, and it'd be very interesting to see what the U.S. elections look like next fall. We're going to have midterm elections, and then obviously who Americans choose as their president come 2024. So I think we need to look at this issue of the future of the transatlantic relationship, not in the context of what happened this week or next week, but over the next several years. I still think a lot of issues are in play, and we could end up with a lot of different futures a decade or so out.
General Allen, we have a few minutes left to talk about today, or to be precise, this very afternoon, as indeed President Biden is meeting with President Putin in Villa Lagrange, overlooking the Lake of Geneva. Do you believe that in a way we are getting back to the Soviet era, where indeed the US and Russia can discuss, engage a constructive discussion on some areas, on some topics, and of course continue to have strong disagreements about values and about foreign policy at large?
Yeah, I don't know whether...
A brief answer, I'm sorry.
I don't know whether it would be the Soviet era as an analogy, but wise statesmanship would have you believe that we have to be able to talk to our opponents. And Russia is clearly an opponent, and it is a threat now. And we should be able to talk to the Russians. And we should have, as many people have said, we should have a predictable relationship with the Russians and a consistent relationship with the Russians. And it should be about human rights. It should be about Russian interference in our and other democracies. It should be about areas where we may have common interests. Arms control is a very important common interest that both our countries share. And then it should be about things that we believe we cannot tolerate out of Russia. And today is not the end. Today should be the beginning. And if we agree that this should be a beginning and that we should always talk to our opponents, then I think that this was the right meeting to have at the right moment early in this administration and in the aftermath of the G7, the NATO summit, and the EU conversation.
So a new beginning, but it is the end, unfortunately, for our session. You will have refreshments downstairs, and the next session will start at 17:40 sharp. The theme, very much alongside many of the arguments our guests have developed, how to restore trust in politics. Thank you very much, General Allen, Mr. Machaus, and of course our friends in Berlin and in Washington, D.C.
Thank you.